Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. It was really garbled on the reverse end. It's an honor and it's a privilege to speak to you. I had received an invitation a little while ago, and I had never heard of Indivisible. And obviously, since then, I've come to learn a lot about the amazing work that you guys do and the way you go about protesting some of the really horrible things that are going on. If we could go to my first slide. So I was, typically when MDs talk, we usually have like hour blankets. And I understand this is just going to be for about 20 minutes, maybe or so. And when I put this together and I said medical developments during Trump's first year, what has gone wrong? And I realized I should have, if I really wanted to keep this brief, I should have just said what has gone right, because so many things have gone wrong. And, we know this in all of society right now. We're seeing it with immigration, with ICE. I heard in Seattle, they raided several of our schools just today. So a lot of really challenging things going on. But as a physician, what I can probably speak best about is the erosion of healthcare that's happened so quickly and in just the first year. Next slide, please. So, if I thought about what are the five biggest, these are maybe just my opinions, but this issue around slashing the number of vaccines that we've seen repeatedly discussed in the New York Times and the Seattle Times and in Washington Post and elsewhere is really huge. And I'm going to spend a couple minutes on that. The fact that we have abandoned mRNA vaccine development is a huge blow, not just for COVID, but for cancer research and HIV research. And so I'll spend a couple of minutes on that too. And then there's been a concerted effort by the Trump administration to really censor medical journals and the CDC. And I have maybe two or three slides on that. And then, this, as people have resigned and left their offices, we're losing really trusted leaders in medical sciences. And I think a good example would be Anthony Fauci or the folks who've just recently resigned from the CDC. And then, of course, just as there have been attacks on universities for being too woke or supposedly not standing up to anti-Semitism, there have been major attacks on medical schools and hospitals. And all of this dovetails into the work I do as a cancer doctor, but also someone who sees a lot of HIV and has a small but substantial immigrant population that comes to see me too. So next slide, please. So I think we all know that there's been huge pushback and changes in the CDC recommendations. And among the things that they did, which were so egregious, was to cut the routine vaccinations for infants and children from 17 to 11. That's a huge change, and I'll spend a moment on the next slide or two talking about that. Certain vaccines like RSV, hepatitis A and B, and meningococcus are now limited to just certain kids, meaning they're not given routinely to every child, but just those who are immunosuppressed. And it's weird to see meningococcus put on that list just because I remember when I was a freshman in college, someone on our floor died from meningococcal infection. They're not frequent, but they're deadly when they happen. And to see us pushing back on certain of these vaccines at a time of vaccine skepticism is really, really bad. And then there are a couple of others where they hit around or couched and said, we're not going to give these vaccines routinely, or we're not going to recommend them routinely, but only after there's been an extensive conversation with the physician and the patient. And that sounds really nice, this shared decision making. But when it comes to routine vaccinations, we've never had that need or never felt that need for ongoing discussions. I think it's something that folks could always opt out of, but to have extensive discussions around COVID and flu and several of the other vaccines is so counterproductive. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we did was, or the CDC and the Trump administration and RFK Jr., was to say that we should adopt best practices. And oddly and weirdly, they came up with Denmark as the location of best practice that we in America should be following. They didn't really provide any kind of explanation. They just said, well, in Denmark, they only use 11, and they're an advanced country. We should follow their lead. But there are really huge distinctions between Denmark and the United States, and I put a couple of them here. One is that we're a population of 340 million. Denmark is the size of Rhode Island. It has like 6 million people. And, it's not a geographically diverse group. It's not a genetically diverse group. They're very homogeneous, unlike in the US, where obviously at 340 million, we have huge geographical challenges, and we also have a remarkably diverse population. So where one size might fit better in Denmark, it definitely does not fit here. The other thing that RFK Jr. Failed to disclose is that, universal health care is available in Denmark to all, which means that everyone has easy access to health care. Quite the opposite from the US, where it's incredibly challenging to see folks. And so if here a person doesn't get their vaccine the time they come in, they may not get another opportunity to do so, and their vaccine may not be covered. So these are really quite huge things. And if we were going to go to a vaccine system or ideal or notion as Denmark does, then probably we should go to a universal healthcare system. And obviously, that's not something that Trump or RFK Jr. or their acolytes have suggested. Next slide, please. So this is a slide, and it's a little dense, but let me just walk you through it. And it just kind of shows the implications and the problems with cutting vaccines in the way that they've done so abruptly and so quickly and with so little discussion. According to the CDC, childhood immunizations in the US between 1994 and 2023 prevented 6 million hepatitis B cases and 940,000 hospitalizations, 4 million cases of hepatitis A, and 78,000 hospitalizations. And this last one is really interesting to me because I don't know if I've seen a case of rotavirus in a number of years. And I was listening to a pediatrician who trained around the same time I did in Philadelphia. And he said that during his residency, their biggest issue was rotavirus in children, and that so many of their children died. And to think about now calling rotavirus a shared decision making and not offering it routinely to children is really, really egregious. There have been a number of groups. When I put these slides together, I put these three as examples, but in truth, 20 different physician groups have signed a mass petition saying that this shouldn't go through. And, perhaps the most strongly opposed to it is the American Pediatric Society. Next slide, please. The other thing is that, HHS canceled $500 million worth of funding for mRNA vaccines, citing safety and efficacy concerns that really have not been borne out in post-marketing surveys. We'd been told repeatedly prior to this year and the change in administration that mRNA vaccines were safe, they were effective, And that, by the CDC estimates, millions of people, quite literally, were saved because of the use of these vaccines. I think we only have to go back to the first year of COVID and those images in New York City of people in body bags because they couldn't get them to the morgue, and they were literally putting them in warehouses because nursing homes could not accommodate them. Also, it's telling that two scientists who spent their careers on mRNA research and where COVID vaccine was their triumph, won the Nobel Prize for their discoveries. Of course, we know that Trump has taken claim of the most recent Nobel Prize in peace, but to think that these are things that we're not going to be funding is so unbelievable, particularly and personally because mRNA vaccines are crucial for the universal HIV vaccine that has been worked on for so many years. And it also spills into cancer-related research and vaccines that are actively being studied as potential cures and treatments for cancer. Next slide, please. So just a slide on vaccine takeaways. Increased death and increased morbidity in the face of choice. By saying we're going to let people have choice, more people are going to suffer. Vaccines have saved over 150 million people worldwide over 50 years. That's half the US population. A one-time MMR vaccine rate slid after the COVID-19 pandemic as vaccine skepticism has really taken hold. And it's so ironic that we're now seeing a resurgence in measles, which is a very potentially highly fatal disease in pediatric populations where they have an immature immunity. In 2024, there were like 280 cases of measles in the entire US. In 2025, that number has increased to about 3,000. And in 2026, it's going up even further. So, this epidemic of measles that we're beginning to see and where we've seen several cases here in Seattle just recently started in West Texas, moved over to South Carolina, moved to Arizona and to Utah. And we're seeing another epidemic unfold right now in South Carolina. And what I wrote here was that the push to alter U.S. vaccine recommendations fits into a broader effort by the Trump administration and many Republican lawmakers to prioritize individual freedoms over collective action. Yet strong public health systems and vaccines in particular rely on collective action to protect those who cannot protect themselves, such as the immune suppressed people, older adults, and young babies. Next slide. Recently, beginning in early 2025, there was also a huge push to censor medical information. And just within weeks of the Trump administration coming into office, they started pulling pages from the Center for Disease Control. And this is a website that people all over the world use as a trusted, probably the most trusted source of information when it comes to infections and vaccinations. And they pulled any language that had to do with things like words literally like diversity, gender identity, LGBTQ. They just completely stripped those web pages from the side or redacted those words. This was at the same time that the Department of Defense started doing the very same thing and removing woke images and languages. Notably Jackie Robinson, who won several awards in World War II for serving, was removed from the website. The Enola Gay, which was the airplane, the name of the plane that bombed Hiroshima, was removed because someone said, "Oh, it's gay. We don't want gay on our website, and they removed it. Several of those things after huge protests were put back in place. Many have still not been put in place. Next slide. In February, the CDC instructed its scientists to stop publishing and to have all their papers reviewed formally by RFK Jr. Any papers that even use the word transgender, a pregnant person, or LGBT, or any other variants of what might be described as woke, were told not to be submitted to medical journals. And of course, we've been bombarded with information about unprecedented layoffs and firings along the CDC and other government-supported agencies. Several of those people have since been rehired, but many have not. And these like trusted huge areas that do so much work, not just for the US, but for the world in general, are working right now at 1/10 capacity, and they're being restricted in what they can say and what they can put out. The MMR, which is the leading journal and website for information about infections and vaccines, along with the CDC website, was put offline a couple weeks into the Trump administration. That MMR journal has been publishing weekly for 80 years before it went offline with no explanation. Next slide. So during 2025, the MMR did reappear, or sorry, in 2026, but with a very severely truncated form with much less information and a lot of inaccuracies to it, reflecting RFK's agenda and that of the Trump administration. Next slide. So one thing that was really interesting was the Department of Justice, at the behest of RFK Jr., sent letters to journal editors for the New England Journal, for Chest, and for Lancet. And they said that really you should not and cannot publish any research that has to do with controversial subjects. Those controversial subjects are on pregnancy, on HIV, on transgender, LGBT, all the things that most of us probably accept as normal and worthy of study. And it was interesting because a number of those journals did push back, and they did say that they were not going to comply. And even though there was huge pressure put on the individual journals, at least so far, the Trump administration, RFK Jr., has not come back and said, we're going to do X, Y, or Z, or we're going to sue you, as we've seen them do with other areas of education. And so I think for a group like you, Indivisible, where the credo of your group is resistance is necessary, and you do such an amazing job of organizing and leading protests and fighting in 100 different ways, I think it can pay off for sure. And it has, at least in a much smaller way, in the effort of these medical journals that are not, are not under the jurisdiction of the federal government, to maintain some form of scientific and academic integrity. Next slide. So I love this quote. I wish it was me who wrote it, but it wasn't. Trump's decision to repay RFK Jr. for his votes with the lead job at HHS will cost lives. People will die because of the politicization of health policy. This is literally making America healthy again by letting sick and weak people die. Next slide. So, I think systematically we've seen efforts by the RFK Jr. to dismantle the American research enterprise. Science must be free from political manipulation to be effective. But as the months go by, we see increasing efforts to stifle scientific autonomy and place political oversight of research funding and an emphasis on ideology and evidence-based decisions. We've seen that very strongly here in Seattle. We have a powerhouse of research institutions from Paul Allen to the Fred Hutch to University of Washington and Children's. And there's been massive efforts to limit their efforts in DEI initiatives, to fund HIV research, homelessness efforts, transgender efforts too. The Trump administration has systematically replaced independent experts with political appointees or industry representatives and aggressively restructured various advisory boards. And the best example is that as overnight, all of the vaccine efforts on the advisory committee for immunization practices were removed without explanation. And the people that they've replaced them with are pseudoscientists and vaccine skeptics, and who have a very strong track record pushing back against the vaccines that many of us would say are essential in a large society. Next slide. So this is kind of a little bit of personal reflection, and this one on my left upper corner, A Battle with My Blood, I wish everyone would read it if you're not familiar with it. It was in the New Yorker, and I Googled it last night, and they've released it so it's not embargoed. So anyone who's curious can read this article. But it's by Tatjana Schlossberg, whose mother is Carolyn Kennedy, and it's the story about how last year she delivered a baby, and this was a super energetic, super healthy woman who, even during the 9th month of her pregnancy, was swimming 2 miles a day. And she delivered her baby, and they saw that her white count was very abnormal. And in short order, that she was diagnosed with acute leukemia, and it's an incredibly rare form. And so the article, which she wrote just a couple weeks before she died, and how she had the presence of mind to write something so articulate and so painful to read, is about her struggle with her cancer, the legacy of the Kennedys, and the pains that they've had, and the utter shock that her uncle, RFK Jr., is leading efforts to stifle research at the very institution that she was getting her cancer care. She also talked about all of the oncologists who were part of her team who were being defunded by federal agencies because of RFK Jr. And the article was not dwelling on RFK Jr. as much as the harm that he's doing for people with cancer, including and obviously herself. So if you haven't read it or you haven't seen it, it got a lot of publicity in the lay press, but worthwhile to just Google A Battle with My Blood and take a look. The other picture I have there is the World Health Organization and the defunding of World Health Organization and other organizations that support HIV care and research, not just in the US, but in third world countries. We were a real leader, and overnight funding was restricted, then eliminated, and people are literally dying because suddenly they don't have access to HIV medication. There's really no good reason for this kind of restriction by the government to save money. But just another example of some really hateful things that we could express against immigrants, that we could express against other groups by Denmark, Greenland, and other areas where we're just forcing our will in a very blind fashion. The other thing that I think is really something, and when we started going to video visits, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, I wasn't sure if it was a good idea. I thought, oh, we need to put our hands on our patients. We need to talk and listen and feel their lymph nodes and their heart. And in fact, after like a few months, I really became convinced that this is a huge innovation. It's something that has really saved people enormous challenges getting to see doctors. And we, at the end of this month, we're going to be put into a crisis mode again, where Congress has not yet ratified continued telehealth visits. They keep pushing it forward for 2 months, but this is something that Republicans, Democrats, Independents should all be able to easily agree. So again, these are just three examples. I could give others, and I will give one or two really quickly. A transgender um, youngster who was about to turn 18 has been waiting to undergo operation for gender reassignment, cannot get it in Washington State right now. And he was getting care at Children's Hospital, and Children's was told that they would be defunded of X, Y, and Z amounts of money if he was continued to go there. And I have no idea what it's like to be transgender, but if I were guess, it would be like being in a swimming pool, holding my breath and just waiting for the day I turn 18 so I could do what I should be doing. And to see someone like this being told that they're not going to be able to get their surgery was just devastating. The other patient I saw recently was a woman from Eritrea who went to Social Security and they asked her if she had done any travel. And she said, yes, I went to Minnesota 6 months ago. And they immediately said, you lied. You did not disclose that you went to Ethiopia and we're taking away your Social Security benefits. Um, Crazy, crazy. She barely speaks English. There's no doubt that she didn't know what she was saying when she talked to them. And she came to clinic crying, not knowing what to do. And luckily, we have some really good social workers, and they were able to connect her to lawyers. But as of that day, they just simply said, "We're not going to be giving you your check." This was a woman who is 78 years old, has HIV, has no has lives alone, and was a university professor in her former life in Eritrea. Next slide. Um, so um, naively, when RFK spoke to Congress, he mentioned that he would work collaboratively with with the health group, which was centered by Bob Cassidy, the pediatrician there. He promised that they wouldn't be undoing current vaccinations. And of course, as quickly as he got into office, he reneged on all those promises. Bill Cassidy, not Bob Cassidy, has been a strong proponent of vaccines his entire career as a pediatrician. And more recently, he's gone on to say he felt duped, that he didn't realize what was going to happen. Hard to imagine that anyone could have believed RFK Jr., even at the time, given that he's had a whole lifetime of opposing and making a lot of money defending those who were trying to sue vaccine makers. Um, Next slide. So it was Albert Einstein who said, unthinking respect for authority is the greatest enemy of the truth. And I think that you guys really embody that. You've been able to attend and organize. I went to your website. I was completely blown away how you said, oh, if you're good at this, you can work on this committee. If you do that, maybe a different committee. But it seems like it's a really big tent, and that's really what you're about. And creating spaces where people can fight back in a safe way. And what I wrote here, which I don't know if it's worth um, reading, but I think you can just see it for yourself. But we've really taken a huge step back in health. And just as we have in so many other areas, in the guise of personal autonomy at the danger of the larger good. Next slide. So, I think we're all under huge stress, and I think we all try to learn as much as we can, and then hopefully at a certain point say, no mas, enough is enough. For myself, I was listening to NPR in the morning and listening to it at night when I'd go home, and then, would turn on the TV after dinner and watch CNN. And then, of course, I'd hear it from my wife, who would go on and on about all the different things that she's been listening to, too. And I think for me personally, in terms of just stress reduction, I am staying aware. I am looking at the New York Times feeds every day, but I'll do it for a limited amount of time. And I'll listen to, rather than listening to NPR, which I love on the way to and from work, I'll listen to books on tape, and it's given me a different perspective and a better way to maybe, for me personally, kind of drown out all the news at a time when ICE is ratcheting up. We're going to be seeing it even more here in Seattle, as they have in Portland and Minnesota and other Democratic states. So with that, I'll stop. I don't know if there are questions, or I don't know. Hopefully I didn't run too far over. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to this group.
Thank you.
So this is David Hardy. How are you doing tonight?
Hey, David, thank you for organizing this or helping with Terry. I will tell you something before you ask me questions. I was kind of taken aback that day you came to my clinic and said, can I talk to you and ask you a few questions? I thought, who is this strange person asking me about things? But after we talked, I really appreciated it, and it provided me with the wherewithal to go to the website and learn a lot more about you too.
Well, it's obvious you work very hard on this talk, and we appreciate that. So I've set aside about 10 or 15 minutes for questions here from the group, if that's okay. And we got a large audience watching you on Zoom, and then we have about 50 or 60 people here in the room.
Oh,
We're
wow.
pretty good attendance tonight, but we're going to try and go through and screen out some questions and get maybe some of the top questions that we saw. In the meantime, while they're doing the screening, I had one I wanted to ask you. And this is related to the editorial you and Dr. Shaw wrote that was published in the Seattle Times. If you remember that, August 14th.
Yes.
And your quote in there, you say, federal policies disrupt the progress being made to combat cancer. Silence is not an option. And our first effort should be reason resistance. So given our group's model to resist the authoritarian takeover of the USA, and given we work to cause good trouble, do you have any recommendations for actions to us as citizens to carry out reasoned resistance?
Yeah, I do. And, I would just to take a moment, Dr. Shai is president of the B'nai Tara Foundation, which is a nonprofit whose goal is to reduce disparities in cancer care across the world. And it's my favorite charity group. The work that, the efforts that we can do, I think I'm speaking as a novice because I'm not an activist. During COVID, I kind of got the idea of writing a blog. It was as much for me to reflect on things and for my patients, but it was useful. I think every time I see like the American Cancer Society or American Society of Hematology, they urge us to write to our Congress people. And we have some really outstanding Congress people who are very receptive from hearing us. And so I think every time there's some policy that smacks incorrectly, like limiting vaccines or cutting back on vaccines, or telling the American public we're going to get rid of telehealth visits. Dave, you're out in Port Townsend, I'm here in Seattle. If you had cancer and you wanted a second opinion and you were sick, the idea of trying to come to Seattle would be overwhelming. And if you can multiply that if you were 80 or 85. So I guess, the short answer is you guys know better than me how to raise your voice. And I think probably it starts with our senators and our US representatives, and it moves up from there. And you guys have such a strong presence in Port Townsend, in Washington State, across the US, that there's a lot of might in the things that you do.
Well, thank you. Scott, do you have any?
Yes. We both have trouble understanding what he's saying.
Okay.
You have some people.
If you, hi Dave, this is Scott Brown.
Hey, Scott, how are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Good to see you again. We have a
My
number of
pleasure.
questions. We have a number of questions, but we'll try to, limit them. I'm just going to do this as randomly as I possibly can. And one of the requests from the audience is make sure that you give us all the volume you can so that we're getting through all mediums to our ears. One of the questions that came through is, to what extent can the private sector backfill funding of clinical research in light of the shutdowns and the cutoff of funding?
Yeah, I think that on an individual basis, Scott, it's really very minor. I mean, how much money can you donate to AMFAR, for example, or for cancer research? It's probably individually, it's quite small. I think the real thing is to get back the federal funding that's been embargoed, and to me, that would be the most important thing. And so rather than individual efforts, which I think can mount to a lot, but become token and allows us to feel better, I would work it through the political cause where the efforts are multiplied so greatly.
Thank you. What leverage does the current administration have over medical journals?
So the journals that are funded by the federal government, like those put out by more MMWR and the CDC, they have complete control over them. They've already limited their publications drastically and only allowing certain articles to be published. They can't restrict, at least right now, they can't restrict the vast majority of medical journals. So my best example would be our best one, the New England Journal of Medicine. They've tried to restrict it along with the Lancet, which is the European equivalent, but they have not been successful so far. But a lot of those articles that are being printed there are being placed by scientists who work for the federal government. And the federal government is saying, you cannot put those articles in those journals. We will not allow you, or we'll take away your office, your space, your monies for your research. So they tried to do it to those where they don't have them directly under their thumb. And those editors fought back very loudly. And as I said, so far they haven't heard anything back. But I think a modus operandi with this group is to, what you say you're going to do, we're going to keep trying in different ways. They have not come back after that original pushback. Again, showing that pushback does have value in these kind of things.
With the cutoff of funding of research, how quickly can clinical studies be reinstated once funding is restored?
It's such a devastating question, and I have no idea. I mean, those people who are depending on funding are getting their funding on an every 6-month yearly basis or 2-year basis. Rarely does a grant last for 5 years. But as soon as that funding is held, those people can't be the people who are doing the work in the labs and the like don't get money immediately. And so many of them have already been laid off. And those people have to look for work elsewhere. So in this kind of environment, we've seen a huge number of scientists leave the US, move to Britain, move to France, move to Europe. Some are even moving to China because they're offering our scientists a lot of opportunity there. And the losses that we've already sustained are going to take years and years to bring back. So we're already being hit with something which won't change in 3 years when Trump is out of office. It's going to have repercussions for the next generation of researchers. And if you think of all the people who are interested in going into public health, and, for many of us physicians, Anthony Fauci is a god. For 50 years, he's been a clear voice on the importance of vaccines and reaching out to disadvantaged folks, and did as good a job as anyone could do during the Trump administration and all the pushback that we learned that he was experiencing, along with several of the other, vaccine experts at the time. But many people are saying, I'm not going to go into public health now. So a huge brain drain is leaving, and a huge number of opportunities where people are leaving, where there'd be opportunities for people to move in, are not being filled. So really, really bad and really devastating. And again, perhaps a generation lost at a time when, this kind of research doesn't stand still. Hopefully it goes somewhere else.
The question we have, and I'll try to keep this brief because I think we're running out of time. Okay, I'm going to submit this last one. Could you tell us more about MMR?
Yeah, so measles, mumps, and rubella. It's a kind of a standard 3-prong vaccine. We've all gotten it when we were kids. And now they're saying, well, we don't have to give it, or we won't give it unless there's a long discussion with the physician before it will be given. So measles, mumps, rubella were diseases that are pretty much gone away. And we're just now seeing the tip of what is an iceberg of new cases of measles. And, in that article by Tatjana Schlossberg, she talks about her father, and she asked him something like, what was it like to get, the polio vaccine? He's old enough to remember that. And he said it was literally like freedom, because at that time kids were developing infantile paralysis that they never recovered from. Many were in iron lungs because they couldn't breathe. And to see a resurgence of measles, which is so highly contagious and such a deadly um, infection, is kind of shocking, particularly since we went from virtually no cases to all of a sudden a mountain of cases. So, this should be something that is standard. A baby is born, they get MMR automatically. That's the way it's been up until now. And now they're saying, no, they can't get those vaccines right away. There has to be informed consent. There has to be further discussion. And many of those parents are already deciding that there's enough uncertainty, and I'll put uncertainty in quotation marks, that they're not going to get them for their kids. And consequently, kids are getting infants very quickly.
I think that's it. Thank you again for the generosity of your time and your expertise. Really appreciate it.
Scott, thank you for being the first one to tell me about your group. And I really admire all the things that you do. And thanks again for inviting me to come and to hear me rant like this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aboulafia.
Good,
Thank
good
you very
night.
much. Good
Thank-
night now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.